Welcome, dear listener. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Before we begin our journey together, I invite you to settle into your most comfortable position. Perhaps you're already nestled under soft blankets, your head cradled by a favorite pillow. Or maybe you're in your favorite chair, wrapped in warmth. Wherever you are, allow yourself to arrive fully in this moment, in this quiet space we're creating together. Let's take a few moments to release the day that's past and prepare for the restful hours ahead. I'll guide you through some gentle breaths, simple, calming breaths that will help ease you into our story. Begin by breathing in slowly through your nose. Let the breath travel deep into your belly. Hold it there gently for a moment. 1, 2, and now release it slowly through your mouth, like a soft sigh, letting any tension flow out with it. Beautiful. Let's do that again. Breathe in through your nose. 2, 3, 4. Feeling your chest and belly expand. Hold. 1, 2, and release through your mouth. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Feeling yourself sink a little deeper into comfort. One more time now. Breathe in slowly, bringing in calm and peace. Hold it gently and release, letting your shoulders drop, your jaw soften, your hands relax completely. Wonderful. Notice how your body feels now. If you're still holding any tension anywhere, perhaps in your shoulders, your brow, or your hands, simply let it go. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to do. This time is yours for rest and gentle wonder. Tonight, we're traveling to a narrow, rain-glossed street in an old quarter of the city, where an antiquarian bookshop has stood for more than 100 years. The shop is called Bellamy and Son, though there hasn't been a son in the business for decades, and the current proprietor, Evelyn Bellamy, is the great-granddaughter of its founder. Our story begins when Evelyn discovers something extraordinary. A diary that's been hidden inside a hollowed-out Victorian ledger for more than a century. The diary belonged to her great-great-grandfather, the shop's founder, and it contains cryptic entries about the treasure in plain sight, and the secret the family must keep. As Evelyn begins to decipher the coded pages with the help of an elderly archivist and a curious historian, she'll uncover a mystery that spans generations. A story of forbidden love, careful preservation, and a literary treasure that's been hiding in her shop all along, disguised and protected, waiting for the right moment to be found. There will be rainy afternoons spent poring over faded ink, quiet conversations over tea in book-lined rooms, and the gradual revelation of a secret so carefully guarded that even Evelyn's own father never knew the full truth. It's a mystery of patience and love, of books that hold more than their printed words, and of the lengths we go to protect what matters most. So let yourself drift deeper now into comfort, and let us begin this gentle tale together. The rain that Wednesday afternoon fell in that particularly British way, steady, patient, and seemingly eternal, turning the cobblestones of Clerkenwell Street to dark mirrors, and sending up the rich scent of wet stone and earth. Inside Bellamy and Son, Evelyn had the lamps lit by 3 o'clock, golden pools of light spreading across the worn oak counters, and illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny galaxies in the still air. Evelyn Bellamy was 63. With silver hair she wore in a practical bun, and reading glasses that hung on a beaded chain against her burgundy cardigan. She'd taken over the shop from her father 20 years ago, and he from his father before that, all the way back to 1847, when Nathaniel Bellamy had opened the doors for the first time. The shop specialized in antiquarian books, maps, and manuscripts. The older and more obscure, the better. She was cataloging a recent estate acquisition that afternoon, a collection of Victorian ledgers and account books from a textile merchant's office. Dull stuff, really, but you never knew what might be tucked between pages or used as packing material. She'd once found a medieval manuscript fragment in a bundle of Victorian shipping receipts. The ledgers were heavy, bound in scuffed brown leather with marbled end papers. As she lifted the 3rd volume, she noticed something odd. It felt wrong. Too light. She opened it, and her breath caught. The center of the book had been carefully hollowed out, creating a secret compartment. Inside lay a small diary, its leather cover the color of dried blood, tied shut with a faded black ribbon. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out. The leather was cool and smooth, well preserved by its hiding place. She untied the ribbon with careful fingers and opened to the first page. The handwriting was immediately familiar. She'd seen it 1,000 times in old shop records and family letters. It was her great-great-grandfather's hand, Nathaniel Bellamy's distinctive copperplate script with its elaborate capitals and precisely measured lines. But the text itself was strange. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1847, and read, "The treasure arrived today, though none who see it know what they see. It must be protected at all costs, hidden in plain sight as we agreed. C trusts me completely. The world would not understand, would not forgive. So it shall remain, disguised among its fellows, waiting for a time when such things matter less than truth." Evelyn read the entry 3 times, her mind already racing. What treasure? Who was C? And what did Nathaniel mean by hidden in plain sight? She turned the page carefully. The next entries were equally cryptic, filled with references to the secret volume, the deception necessary for preservation, and the promise I made to honor this above all things. Some entries appeared to be in code, strings of letters and numbers that made no immediate sense. Others referenced books, but by mysterious descriptions rather than titles. The false Dante checked today remains undisturbed. The poetry collection grows, our secret protected by their proper company. Evelyn glanced up at the shop around her, at the floor-to-ceiling shelves that lined every wall, at the narrow aisles between bookcases, at the alcoves and corners filled with volumes of every size and age. Somewhere in this shop, if Nathaniel's diary was to be believed, was something extraordinary, something that had been hiding for more than a century and a half. She looked back down at the diary and turned another page, finding an entry from June of 1847. I have had the binding done perfectly. Even an expert would be fooled. C would be pleased, I think, though we shall never speak of this again. The risk is too great, but I am confident it will endure here, protected by anonymity and the sheer quantity of its companions. A secret kept by being unseen, though visible to all. Evelyn felt a thrill of excitement, the particular joy that only a lifelong lover of books could feel at such a discovery. This was a puzzle, a genuine mystery from her own family history, and it was waiting in her shop to be solved. She glanced at the clock on the wall, nearly 5 already, and she was expecting no more customers on such a dreary evening. She locked the shop door, turned the sign to closed, and made herself a pot of strong tea in the small kitchen at the back of the shop. Then, settling into her favorite chair by the fire in the shop's reading corner, she began to work through the diary from the beginning, reading each entry carefully, making notes in her own leather journal about anything that might be a clue. The diary covered only a few months, March through September of 1847, the year the shop opened. Many entries were mundane, recording the acquisition of books, visits from customers, notes about repairs and binding work. But scattered throughout were these mysterious references to the secret, the treasure, the thing that must be protected. One entry in particular caught her attention. It was dated April 20th, 1847. The collection must appear entirely ordinary. I have therefore commissioned 30 additional volumes in the same style, all genuine works of similar period and origin. Our one precious fruit will hide perfectly among this forest. The binding matches exactly same leather, same gilt, same dimensions. Even the wear patterns have been replicated. It is, if I may say, a masterpiece of deception in service of preservation. So whatever Nathaniel had hidden, he'd surrounded it with similar books, camouflage. That was clever, but it also meant that finding it would require more than just looking. She'd need to understand what she was looking for. Evelyn spent the evening filling pages with notes. C appeared repeatedly, clearly someone Nathaniel trusted. Someone who had given him this mysterious item to protect. The references to it being something the world would not understand or would not forgive suggested something controversial for the Victorian era. She found one more crucial clue before the fire burned low and her eyes grew tired. An entry from July 3rd, 1847. The poetry section grows appropriately. Our secret rests among romantics and early Victorians, where it belongs by right of birth, if not by law. I have marked my personal catalog with the sign we agreed upon 3 small stars in the margin, visible only to one who knows to look. Should anything happen to me, this diary and that mark are the only keys. Evelyn sat up straighter, fatigue forgotten. A personal catalog with a mark, 3 stars in the margin. She knew immediately what Nathaniel meant. The shop had dozens of old catalogs and inventories, many in Nathaniel's own hand. She'd seen them countless times, filed in the office upstairs. She stood, joints protesting after hours in the chair, and climbed the narrow stairs to the office above the shop. The room was lined with filing cabinets and shelves holding the business records of nearly 2 centuries. She found the section containing Nathaniel's original inventories and carefully withdrew the first volume, dated 1840-71850, bringing it back downstairs to better light. She began to page through slowly, examining each margin with care. It was past midnight when she found it, and she nearly cried out with excitement. There, on a page listing poetry acquisitions from spring 1847, were 3 tiny stars drawn in pencil next to a single entry. Byron Shelley Keats Collection, 31 volumes, early Victorian binding, burgundy leather, gilt-edged. Purchased estate sale, March 1847, pound 12.10, 31 volumes. Nathaniel had written about commissioning 30 additional volumes to hide one precious treasure. 30 ordinary volumes to disguise one extraordinary one. Evelyn looked around the shop. The poetry section took up an entire wall near the back. Hundreds of volumes spanning centuries. But she knew her own inventory, knew what collections had been in the shop for generations versus what had been acquired more recently. She walked to the poetry section and began searching for burgundy leather, early Victorian bindings, gilt-edged pages. And there, on a shelf at eye level, was a collection of 31 matching volumes by Byron, Shelley, Keats, and other romantic and early Victorian poets, all bound identically in rich burgundy leather with gilt edges and similar gilt tooling on the spines. They looked, as Nathaniel had intended, entirely unremarkable. A handsome collection, certainly, but nothing that would make you look twice. They'd been in the shop so long they were almost invisible, just part of the landscape of books that filled every space. Evelyn ran her fingers along the spines, her heart beating faster. Somewhere among these 31 volumes was something extraordinary, something worth hiding for more than a century. But which one, and what was it? She carefully withdrew all 31 volumes and carried them, 2 and 3 at a time, to the table in the reading corner. She laid them out in rows, examining each spine, each cover. They were indeed nearly identical, same leather, same gilt, same dimensions, same style of binding. But as she looked more closely, one volume caught her eye, the third book in the second row. It was a collection of Shelley's works, the spine reading simply, Shelley, Poems 1840. The gilt on this spine was ever so slightly brighter than the others, as though it had been handled less. And when she picked it up, it felt fractionally heavier than its neighbors. She opened it carefully to the title page and froze. The title page read, Poems by Percy Bysshe Shelley, late edition, London, 1840. But pasted onto the facing page was a small bookplate she'd never seen before, a simple design of 2 intertwined flowers, forget-me-nots perhaps, and beneath them 2 sets of initials, NB and CT. Evelyn's hands shook as she turned to the next page. The text appeared to be Shelley's poetry, but as she read, something felt wrong. The rhythm was off, the language too modern. She grabbed a standard edition of Shelley from the shelf and compared the first poem. They were completely different. This wasn't Shelley at all. With dawning understanding, she turned back to the title page and looked more carefully at it, tilting the book toward the lamp. And there, so subtle she'd almost missed it, was evidence of alteration. The title page had been carefully removed from a genuine Shelley volume and expertly reinserted here. This was a fake Shelley. The binding was real, early Victorian as described, but the contents. She turned to the final page of the book and found what she was looking for, a small notation in pencil, nearly invisible in the margin. CT 1847. These were poems by CT, the mysterious C from Nathaniel's diary. And they'd been disguised as a Shelley collection, hidden in plain sight for more than 150 years. But who was C.T.? And why had these poems needed such elaborate protection? Evelyn made more tea as the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows. Then she settled back in her chair and began to read the poems properly from the beginning. They were beautiful, lyrical, passionate, exploring themes of love and nature and freedom, with a voice that reminded her of the romantic poets, but felt distinctly individual. Many were love poems, addressed to an unnamed thee, with an intensity that made her breath catch. But as she read deeper into the collection, she began to understand why they needed to be hidden. The pronouns in the love poems were inconsistent, sometimes masculine, sometimes feminine, sometimes deliberately ambiguous. And several poems spoke quite openly about love between women, about the pain of hiding, about wanting a world where such love could exist freely. In Victorian England, such poems would have been scandalous, possibly criminal. The author would have faced social ruin, possibly worse. Evelyn felt a deep tenderness toward her great-great-grandfather, toward this Nathaniel she'd never known, but whose careful preservation had kept these poems safe for more than a century. He must have cared deeply for C.T., must have understood the importance of protecting not just the poems themselves, but the identity of the poet. She read through the night, learning the voice of this unknown poet, feeling the ache of their hidden life. And as dawn began to lighten the windows and the rain finally stopped, she knew what she needed to do. She needed to find out who C.T. was, and she needed to share these poems with the world, if that was what the poet would have wanted. But first, she needed help. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Evelyn had made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Marcus Ainsley, a retired literature professor from University College London, who had occasionally consulted for the shop on matters of attribution and provenance. The second was to Grace Chen, the head archivist at the London Metropolitan Archives, with whom Evelyn had collaborated on several historical research projects over the years. Both had immediately sensed the excitement in her voice and had agreed to come to the shop that afternoon. Evelyn spent the morning rereading the poems and going through Nathaniel's diary more carefully, creating a timeline of events and a list of everything she knew. The diary covered March through September 1847. C.T. was someone Nathaniel knew and trusted deeply. The poems were given to Nathaniel for safekeeping. Nathaniel commissioned the disguised binding and purchased 30 genuine volumes to camouflage the false one. The relationship and poems needed to be hidden because they would not be understood or forgiven by Victorian society. The poems themselves were of remarkably high quality, comparable to published poets of the era. Several poems explicitly referenced love between women. She was examining the bookplate again, those intertwined forget-me-nots, and the initials when the shop bell chimed. Dr. Ainsley entered first, shaking water from his umbrella, despite the fact that the rain had stopped hours ago, a precautionary measure, Evelyn supposed. He was a tall man in his 70s, with unruly white hair and kind eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. "My dear Evelyn," he said, "you sounded quite mysterious on the phone. What treasure have you unearthed?" Grace arrived moments later, a petite woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner. She carried a leather document case and wore the slightly distracted expression of someone whose mind was always halfway in a different century. Evelyn locked the shop door, hung the by appointment only sign, and led them to the reading corner, where she'd laid out the false Shelley volume alongside Nathaniel's diary and her notes. She told them the story of the discovery, watching their faces change from polite interest to genuine excitement as they understood the significance of what she'd found. Marcus lifted the poetry volume with reverent hands and began to read, his lips moving silently. After several minutes, he looked up with wonder in his eyes. "Evelyn, these are remarkable, truly remarkable. The voice is confident, mature. This is not an amateur poet. The technical skill is exceptional, the emotional depth considerable." He read aloud, "In gardens where we dare not walk by day, we meet as shadows meet when sun descends, and speak in glances what we cannot say, and hold in secret what the world offends." "Beautiful," Grace murmured, "and heartbreaking, given the context. To have to hide such work, such feeling. The question," Evelyn said, "is who was C.T.? And can we discover their identity after all this time?" Grace was already opening her document case and pulling out a laptop, a slightly incongruous sight in the book-filled, Victorian-feeling shop. "The initials and the date give us a starting point. If C.T. was close enough to your great-great-grandfather to trust him with something so precious, there might be some record of their connection. I've been through the shop records," Evelyn said, but Nathaniel was discreet. His business ledgers from 1847 record hundreds of transactions, but rarely include more than surnames and brief descriptions. "What about personal papers?" Marcus asked. "Letters, family documents. The family archive is fairly sparse. My grandfather cleared out a lot of material in the 1960s, unfortunately. But there are some letters and photographs upstairs. I haven't gone through them in years. Let's start there," Grace suggested. and I can search the Metropolitan Archives for any Bellamy family records. We might have wills, property records. Things like that might mention associates or friends. They spent the next hour in the office upstairs, going through 3 boxes of family papers. Most were business correspondence, bills of sale, inventory disputes, the mundane machinery of running a shop across generations. But in the second box, Marcus found something useful, a small cache of personal letters to Nathaniel, tied with string. Most were from family members, but several were from friends and acquaintances, and one, dated February 1847, was signed simply C. Marcus read it aloud. "My dear Nathaniel, your offer moves me beyond expression. I scarce dare accept such kindness, such risk on your part. But I find I must, for the alternative is to see them destroyed, and that I cannot bear. They are the truest part of me, the one place where I have not had to dissemble or hide. You ask why I do not simply publish under a pseudonym, as others have done. But you know as well as I do that the content alone would be enough to destroy me if my identity were discovered. And beyond the question of my own reputation, there are others to consider: my family, my father's position, the scandal that would touch them all. So yes, my friend, I accept your offer with gratitude that makes my hand shake as I write this. You will keep them safe, you say, disguised and preserved, until such time as the world is ready for such truths. I trust you completely in this. I will bring the manuscript to you on March 12th, after dark. We will say our farewells then, for I think it best we do not meet again for some time. The fewer connections that can be traced, the better. With deepest affection and gratitude, C. March 12th, Evelyn said, checking Nathaniel's diary. And he wrote on March 15th that the treasure had arrived. The timeline fits perfectly. The letter mentions a father, a family position, Grace noted. Someone with something to lose beyond just their own reputation. That suggests middle or upper class, someone whose family had social standing, and educated, Marcus added. The handwriting is excellent, the prose style polished. This is someone with significant education, unusual for a woman in that era, unless she was from a privileged background. We're assuming C is a woman, Evelyn asked. Given the content of the poems, Marcus said gently, and the reference to relationships between women, it seems likely, though not certain, of course. Grace was typing rapidly on her laptop. I'm searching our archives for any records of women with the initials CT connected to Clerkenwell, or to any Bellamy family members in the 1840s. It's a long shot, but we have fairly comprehensive rate books from the period, and some legal documents that might help. They continued searching through the family papers, finding 2 more letters from C, both brief and carefully vague, mentioning mutual friends, but no specifics. One, dated August 1847, thanked Nathaniel for preserving what matters most, and mentioned that C was leaving London for a time. Marcus was examining the bookplate again through a magnifying glass. "These forget-me-nots," he said slowly. "They're very specifically rendered, and the style of the engraving, I've seen something similar somewhere. May I borrow this to check against some bookplate catalogs? There were several prominent engravers working in London in the 1840s. If we can identify who made this, we might be able to trace who commissioned it." "Of course," Evelyn said. Grace looked up from her computer, excitement in her eyes. "I think I may have found something. There's a Clerkenwell rate book from 1846 that lists a property on Farringdon Street occupied by a Thomas Thornton, barrister, along with his wife, son, and daughter. The daughter's name was Catherine. Catherine Thornton," Evelyn whispered. "CT. It's not proof," Grace cautioned. "But the location is right. Farringdon Street is just a few blocks from here, and the timing fits. Thornton is listed as having considerable property, suggesting a family of means." "What happened to them?" Marcus asked. Grace scrolled through more records. "Thomas Thornton died in 1851. The property was sold. His wife Anne is listed in the 1861 census as living in Bath with her son. But I don't see any mention of Catherine after 1847. She might have married," Evelyn suggested. "Possibly. The women who married typically appear in census records under their husbands' names and households. Let me search marriage records." While Grace searched, Marcus examined the poems again. "If this is Catherine Thornton, and if these poems are as accomplished as I believe they are, she may have published other work under a different name or pseudonym. Several women poets in this era published anonymously or under male pseudonyms. How could we possibly identify which works might be hers?" Evelyn asked. "Voice," Marcus said simply. "Every poet has a distinctive voice, particular patterns of language, rhythm, imagery. If Catherine published other work, even under a false name, a careful analysis might reveal similarities to these poems." Grace made a small sound of triumph. "I found her. Catherine Ann Thornton married in September 1847, a few months after giving the poems to Nathaniel. She married a man named Edward Ashford, a merchant involved in the India trade. Married and left London," Evelyn said, thinking of the letter that mentioned leaving the city. "Taking her secret with her." "There's more," Grace said, reading from the screen. Edward Ashford died in 1852 in Calcutta. Catherine returned to England as a widow. The 1861 census lists her in Bath, but not with her mother and brother. She's living independently, listed as Catherine Ashford, widow, woman of letters. Woman of letters, Marcus repeated. That suggests she was writing, perhaps publishing. The 1871 census lists her at the same address in Bath. Grace continued. Still independent, still described as woman of letters. She died in 1879, according to the death records, buried in Bath Abbey Cemetery. Evelyn felt a strange sadness. Catherine Thornton had lived another 32 years after entrusting her poems to Nathaniel, had become Catherine Ashford, had made a life as a writer. But had she ever been able to write honestly about who she was, whom she loved? If she was publishing, Marcus said, we need to search for works by women poets from the 1850s through 1870s that match her style and themes. It's a considerable task, but not impossible. I can help with that, Grace offered. The British Library has extensive collections of Victorian periodicals and poetry volumes. Many women published in periodicals first before collecting their work in book form. What about Bath? Evelyn asked. Might there be records there, personal papers, letters, anything that could give us more information about her life? Grace made notes. The Bath Central Library has an excellent local history collection. And the cemetery, there might be more than just a burial record. Sometimes family monuments include biographical information. They worked through the afternoon, piecing together what they could of Catherine Thornton's life. Marcus took high-resolution photographs of several poems to compare against published works. Grace compiled a list of every publication by women poets from the relevant decades that she could find references to, and Evelyn went back through Nathaniel's diary, reading more carefully now that she knew who C was, looking for any other clues she might have missed. She found one more crucial piece of information in an entry from September 1847. C came to say goodbye today. She is to be married in a week and will leave London soon after. She seemed both relieved and melancholy. Perhaps, she said, in my new life I will find a way to write truly again, though under another name. These poems, at least, will survive as they are, as I am, kept safe by your friendship. And perhaps one day, when the world is different, someone will find them and understand. I promised her that they would be safe, that I would pass the secret to my son when the time is right, and he to his son, so that they might never be lost or destroyed. She smiled at that and said, a relay of guardians then, until the world catches up to what the heart has always known. She left me the bookplate she had commissioned. The forget-me-nots are for remembrance, she said, and for constancy. The 2 sets of initials represent her hope that we will both be remembered someday, not just as shopkeeper and customer, but as friends who fought, in our small way, for truth against concealment. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. Nathaniel had meant to pass the secret down, but somewhere along the line, the chain had broken. Her great-grandfather, her grandfather, her father, none of them had known. The diary had been hidden away, and the false Shelley had simply become part of the invisible landscape of the shop's stock. Until now, I think, she said slowly, that Catherine's wish is coming true. The world is different now. Not perfect, but different enough. And she deserves to be remembered, to have her work known. But carefully, Marcus cautioned. We need to be certain of our attribution, and we need to understand what she published under other names, if anything. This discovery is important, not just as a curiosity, but as a contribution to literary history, a significant woman poet whose work has been lost until now. Then we have more work to do, Grace said with satisfaction. Research trips to make, archives to visit, patterns to trace. And Evelyn added, I'd like to visit Bath, to see where she lived, where she's buried, to understand the life she made after 1847. They agreed to meet again in a week, each pursuing different threads of the investigation. Marcus would search for published works that matched Catherine's style. Grace would dig deeper into census records, wills, and any other documents that might reveal more about Catherine's life. And Evelyn would travel to Bath to visit the library, the archives, and Catherine's grave. As her friends prepared to leave, Evelyn carefully wrapped the false Shelley volume in acid-free paper and placed it in the shop's safe. Before closing the safe door, she looked once more at the bookplate, those intertwined forget-me-nots, those 2 sets of initials. Don't worry, Catherine, she whispered. We'll tell your story. We'll remember. Evelyn took the train to Bath the following Tuesday, watching the countryside slide past under gray skies that threatened rain, but never quite delivered. She'd packed carefully her laptop, a notebook, photocopies of the relevant diary entries, and photographs of several of Catherine's poems. She'd also brought her father's old camera. If she found Catherine's grave, she wanted to photograph it, to document this connection across generations. The train arrived in Bath just after noon. Evelyn checked into a small hotel near the Abbey, then walked through the historic city center, getting her bearings. Bath felt different from London, more compact, more golden, with its distinctive honey-colored stone and Georgian architecture. She'd made an appointment with the local history librarian at the Bath Central Library for 2 o'clock. When she arrived, she was greeted by a woman named Harriet Moss, probably in her 40s, with an air of quiet competence and the slightly inky fingers that marked her as a fellow lover of old documents. Evelyn explained her research as they walked through corridors lined with reference books to a small reading room where Harriet had already pulled several volumes. Catherine Ashford, Harriet said, settling at the table. When you called, the name rang a bell, so I did some preliminary research. I think you'll be pleased with what I found. She opened one of the books, a local directory from 1865. Catherine Ashford lived at 14 Royal Crescent from 1861 until her death in 1879. She was well known in Bath literary circles. Look here. She indicated an entry in what appeared to be a social directory. Mrs. Catherine Ashford, widow, authoress, is noted for her Tuesday afternoon salons, which attract poets, writers, and thinkers from throughout the region. Mrs. Ashford has published several volumes of poetry and essays, primarily in the periodicals, the Englishwoman's Review and Victoria magazine, both publications known for their progressive views on women's education and rights. She was writing, Evelyn breathed. She found a way. Indeed, Harriet said, and there's more. I found references to 3 published volumes under her name: Reflections on Nature and Society in 1863, Songs of Experience in 1868, and Final Verses published posthumously in 1880. They're quite rare now, but we have copies of all 3 in our special collections. She produced 3 slim volumes, their cloth covers faded, but still intact. Evelyn opened the first one reverently, reading the title page, Reflections on Nature and Society, being a collection of poems and essays by Mrs. Catherine Ashford, Bath, 1863. The poems inside were beautiful, thoughtful meditations on nature, society, women's roles, friendship, and freedom. But they were careful poems, circumspect, never quite as raw or revealing as the ones hidden in Nathaniel's shop. May I compare these to some other samples? Evelyn asked, pulling out her photographs of Catherine's hidden poems. Of course. What are these? Evelyn explained the discovery of the false Shelley, the diary, the evidence that Catherine had written more openly in her youth. As she spoke, Harriet's eyes widened with growing excitement. This is extraordinary, Harriet whispered. To have both her public and private work, to see what she felt she could publish versus what she had to hide. It's a window into the constraints women faced, especially women who loved other women. They spent the next 2 hours comparing the poems. voice was clearly the same patterns of imagery, the same musical quality to the lines, the same particular way of using natural metaphors for emotional states. But the published poems were muted, restrained, lovely, but safe. "It's heartbreaking," Harriet said softly, "to see how much she had to hold back. These published poems are good, but those early ones you found, those are great. Those are poems that speak across centuries. Did she ever marry again? Have children?" Evelyn asked. Harriet shook her head. "No, she lived alone, or with female companions. The census records list companion or friend living with her at various times. She seems to have created a life that gave her independence and community, if not the freedom to express everything openly. The salons she hosted," Evelyn said. "Do you know anything about them?" Harriet smiled. "Actually, yes. One of Bath's other historical residents, a diarist named Mary Ellsworth, wrote extensively about the social scene in Bath during the 1860s and 70s. She mentions Catherine Ashford's salons several times. Hold on." She went to fetch another volume and returned with a leather-bound diary. Mary Ellsworth's diaries were donated to us by her descendants. This is volume 8 from 1867. Listen to this. She read aloud. "Attended Mrs. Ashford's salon this afternoon. A remarkable gathering. As always, several poets of note, a philosopher from Oxford, and a number of forward-thinking women discussing the latest articles on women's suffrage. Mrs. Ashford herself spoke little, but listened to all with keen attention, occasionally offering observations of such insight that the entire room fell silent to hear them. She has a quality about her, a sadness, perhaps, or a depth of feeling, that makes one sense she has lived more fully, and perhaps suffered more deeply than she allows the world to see. Her poetry, lovely as it is, seems to me but a fraction of what she might say, if only society would permit such truth." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. Mary Ellsworth had sensed it, that gap between what Catherine wrote and what she felt, the constraint of the age she lived in. "There's one more thing you should see," Harriet said gently. "Catherine's grave. I can show you where it is, if you'd like to visit." They took a taxi to Bath Abbey Cemetery, a beautiful Victorian garden cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Harriet led her through winding paths between monuments, past angels and obelisks, to a section where smaller, more modest stones stood. Catherine's grave was marked by a simple granite headstone, weathered but still legible. Catherine Ann Ashford, 1821-1879 poet and friend to truth. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. The quote is from Shakespeare, Harriet said softly. Sonnet 116, a poem about unchanging love. Evelyn knelt beside the grave, running her fingers over the carved letters. She thought of Catherine giving those poems to Nathaniel, trusting him to keep them safe. Thought of her marrying and leaving London, building a life in Bath, hosting salons, publishing careful poems, living with female companions. She'd found a way to live with dignity and some degree of honesty, even if not complete freedom. And she'd trusted that someday the world would be ready for her full truth. "We found you, Catherine," Evelyn whispered, "and we'll make sure your poems are remembered." She took several photographs of the grave, then stood and turned to Harriet. "Is there any way to find out who her companions were? The women who lived with her. The census records list names," Harriet said. "And there might be other references in local newspapers, obituaries, society notices. I can research that and send you what I find. Thank you for all of this. It's important work," Harriet said firmly. "Recovering these lost voices, making sure they're not forgotten again." They walked back through the cemetery together, discussing next steps. Harriet would search for more information about Catherine's life in Bath, her companions, her salon attendees. She'd also look for any surviving correspondence or personal effects that might have been donated to local collections. That evening, back in her hotel room, Evelyn called Marcus. "I found her published work," she told him. 3 volumes, all under her own name, Catherine Ashford. The poems are beautiful, but restrained. Nothing like the rawness of what she gave to Nathaniel. The public versus private voice, Marcus said thoughtfully. It's a common pattern with marginalized writers. What they can say versus what they must hide. Have you compared them formally? The Bath librarian and I went through them. The voice is unmistakably the same imagery, same rhythms. But the content is so much safer. I've been making progress too, Marcus said. I found a poem in an 1865 issue of the Englishwoman's Review that's attributed to C. Ashford. It's a response to a recent parliamentary debate about women's property rights. Clever, impassioned, and beautifully crafted. She was political, Evelyn said. Many women writers were, especially in the reform periodicals. It was one of the few acceptable outlets for women's anger and frustration with their circumstances. I'm compiling a list of all her periodical publications. It's impressive. She was prolific once she found outlets that would publish her, but never the poems she really wanted to share. No, Marcus agreed quietly. Those stayed hidden, or at least they did until now. They talked for another half hour, comparing notes and planning the next steps. Grace had also made progress, finding a will that mentioned Catherine leaving her personal papers to a niece, though where those papers had ended up was still a mystery. "It's coming together," Marcus said, slowly, as these things do. "But we're painting a picture of a complete person, not just a name and some poems, but a life lived with courage and creativity, despite enormous constraints." After she hung up, Evelyn sat by the window of her hotel room, looking out over Bath's glowing evening streets, and thought about Catherine Thornton, Catherine Ashford, this woman who had lived so many years ago, but whose words still resonated, whose courage still mattered. Tomorrow she would return to London and continue the work. But tonight, she felt she was keeping Catherine company somehow, sitting vigil across the years, making sure she wasn't alone or forgotten. Back in London, Evelyn threw herself into the research with renewed energy. She spent her days in the shop, working on regular business, but with Catherine's false Shelley volume nearby, returning to it, often to reread the poems, to feel connected to the mystery she was unraveling. Marcus visited twice more, each time bringing new discoveries. He'd found a dozen periodical publications by Catherine Ashford, ranging from political essays to nature poems, to a remarkably sharp piece of literary criticism about Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh. She was respected in her time, he told Evelyn during his second visit, spreading photocopied articles across the reading table. Not famous, but recognized in progressive literary circles. Several of these pieces were cited by other writers. She had influence, but always within acceptable bounds, Evelyn observed. Exactly. She learned where the lines were and wrote carefully within them. But look at this. He pointed to an essay from 1871 about women's education, published in Victoria magazine. In it, Catherine argued passionately for women's access to universities, using language that was almost sharp in its criticism of contemporary attitudes. We are told that women's delicate minds cannot bear the rigors of serious study. Yet, I observe no difficulty when it comes to the rigorous demands of household management, child rearing, or the complex social calculations required to maintain one's reputation in society. It seems that rigor is only problematic when it might lead to women's intellectual independence. There's anger there, Marcus said, carefully modulated, acceptable in the context of an essay on education, but genuine anger about women's constraints. Evelyn thought of the early poems, their frank discussion of forbidden love, of having to hide one's true self. That anger had been there all along, at having to conceal, to perform acceptability, to live a partial life. Grace's research was yielding fruit too. She'd traced Catherine's niece, the one mentioned in the will, to a family that had eventually settled in Cornwall. She'd contacted the current descendants, explaining about the research, and they'd been immediately helpful. They have a box of Catherine's papers, Grace told Evelyn excitedly over the phone. Letters, manuscripts, a journal. They've agreed to let me examine them. I'm going to Cornwall this weekend. Let me come with you, Evelyn said immediately. I want to see what she left behind. They met at Paddington Station on Saturday morning and took the train west, watching London give way to suburbs, then to countryside, then to the wilder, more dramatic landscapes of the West Country. They talked the whole way, both feeling the anticipation of another piece of the puzzle falling into place. The descendants, a retired couple named James and Louise Hartley, met them at Truro Station and drove them to their farmhouse on the outskirts of the city. Over tea and homemade biscuits in a sunny kitchen, Louise explained the connection. Catherine Ashford was my great-great-great-aunt, she said. She had a sister, Mary, who married and had children. I'm descended from Mary's line. Catherine never had children herself, so when she died, everything went to Mary and Mary's daughter, who was Catherine's favorite niece, also named Catherine after her. Do you know much about the original Catherine? Grace asked. Only what's been passed down, that she was a writer, that she lived independently in Bath, that the family was quite proud of her. My grandmother used to say she was ahead of her time and had opinions that sometimes shocked people. Louise smiled. I always liked that about her. The box of papers, James said, standing. I'll fetch it. We've had it stored in a cupboard for years. Louise's grandmother mentioned them now and then, but never looked through them much. Catherine's private things, she called them. He returned carrying a small steamer trunk, battered and scuffed, but still solid. He set it on the kitchen table, and Louise produced an old key. Grandmother gave me this years ago, she said, unlocking the trunk. Said I should decide what to do with Catherine's papers when I was ready. I suppose this is the right time. Inside were bundles of letters tied with ribbon, several leather-bound journals, loose manuscript pages, and what looked like a small wooden box. Evelyn felt her heart racing as she carefully lifted out the first journal. The handwriting was Catherine's, the same elegant script from the hidden poems. She opened to a random page and read, May 12th, 1863. The salon was well attended today. Discussed Barrett Browning's latest work. Margaret was there, reading with such passion that I could scarcely breathe. How is it that I still feel this way after all these years? as though time has taught me nothing about how to contain or disguise what rises in my chest when she speaks. Margaret, a name at last. Grace leaned over her shoulder, reading. A companion, she said softly. Someone Catherine cared for deeply. They spent the next 3 hours carefully going through the trunk's contents, with Louise and James occasionally exclaiming over something they found. The journals covered Catherine's life from 1861 to 1878, the last year before her death. They were intensely personal, full of reflections on her reading, her writing, her friendships, and her feelings for several women over the years, but especially for Margaret. Margaret Templeton, it emerged, was a widow Catherine had met in 1862. They'd lived together from 1863 until Margaret's death in 1874, presenting themselves to the world as companions and friends, but clearly in the journals being much more. Catherine wrote about Margaret with tenderness and passion, about their quiet domestic life, their shared love of literature and music, about the grief of concealment and the joy of private truth. And she wrote about the pain of Margaret's death, the loss of the person who had seen and loved her fully. This is a love story, Louise said quietly, looking at Evelyn and Grace. Isn't it? They were partners. Yes, Evelyn said, they were. Louise was quiet for a moment, then smiled. Good for them. Finding each other, making a life together, even when the world didn't approve. Grandmother was right. Catherine was ahead of her time. In one of the journals from 1875, a year after Margaret's death, Catherine wrote about the poems she'd entrusted to Nathaniel. I think often of those early poems, the ones I gave to Nathaniel Bellamy so long ago. They were written in the flush of first understanding myself, when I still believed the world might change quickly enough that I could publish them, sign my name to them proudly. I was young then, and hopeful, and in love with E, though that came to nothing. Now I am older and perhaps wiser, though wisdom brings its own sorrows. I am glad I gave those poems to Nathaniel for safekeeping. They are the truest thing I ever wrote, unfiltered by what society would bear. Everything else I've published has been translated through the lens of what's permissible. Still good work, I hope, still honest in its way, but not the complete truth. If someone finds them someday, those early poems, I hope they understand. I hope the world has changed enough that they won't seem shocking or shameful, just honest. And I hope they'll see that I lived as fully as I could within the boundaries I was given, loved as deeply as I could manage, and wrote toward truth even when I had to dress it in acceptable garments. That's all any of us can do, isn't it? Live as honestly as our times allow, and trust that future times will be kinder. Evelyn felt tears on her cheeks. Catherine had known, had hoped, had trusted that someday someone would find her poems and understand. The small wooden box in the trunk contained letters, correspondence between Catherine and Nathaniel that had been preserved after his death, and somehow made its way back to Catherine. There were a dozen letters spanning from 1847 to 1875, chronicling their lifelong friendship. In one letter from 1872, Nathaniel wrote, "My dear Catherine, your poems remain safe, as I promised so many years ago. My son knows of them now. I have passed the knowledge and the responsibility to him, as I always intended. He understands their value and their secrecy. They will be preserved for as long as the shop stands, waiting for a time when they can be read and celebrated as they deserve." Catherine's reply, written a week later: "Thank you, my dear old friend, for keeping faith all these years. Knowing they are safe has been a comfort through many difficulties. Perhaps when we are both dust, the world will be ready for such truths. I like to imagine that some future person finding them and thinking, 'Ah yes, this is how it was. This is what they felt.' It's a kind of immortality, I suppose, though a very patient one." Evelyn and Grace left Cornwall that evening, with the Hartleys' blessing to make copies of the journals and letters for their research. Louise had been deeply moved to learn the full story of her great-great-great-aunt. Proud of her courage and her creativity, "I think we should tell people about her," Louise had said firmly. "Not hide anything. She deserves to be known as she actually was." On the train back to London, Evelyn and Grace sat in comfortable silence, both processing what they'd learned. Catherine's life was coming into focus, a full, complex life lived with courage and compromise, love and loss, creativity and constraint. "We have enough now, don't we?" Evelyn said finally. "Enough to write her story, to publish the poems with proper context and attribution." "I think so," Grace agreed. Between the poems themselves, Nathaniel's diary, the published works, the journals, and the letters, we can tell the complete story. Not just a curiosity or a discovery, but a real understanding of who she was and what her work means. "Marcus will want to write the scholarly introduction," Evelyn said. "He's been working on the literary analysis. And we should include selections from the journals and letters, show both the public and private Catherine how she navigated her world." "What will you do with the false Shelley volume?" Grace asked. "Keep it in the shop." Evelyn thought about that. "I think I'll donate it eventually to a university collection or museum. Somewhere it can be preserved properly and studied. But not yet. For now, I want it where Catherine wanted it, in Bellamy and Son, in the shop that protected it for more than a century. They arrived back in London late, but Evelyn went straight to the shop before going home. She unlocked the door, turned on one lamp in the reading corner, and took the false Shelley volume from the safe where she'd been keeping it. She sat in her favorite chair and paged through it slowly, reading poems she already knew by heart now, but that still moved her deeply. Here was Catherine's voice, young and brave and honest, speaking across nearly 200 years to anyone who would listen. And here, in this shop, her great-great-grandfather had built. The promise he'd made had been kept. The poems had survived, hidden in plain sight, protected by friendship and family duty until the world was ready. Evelyn thought about Nathaniel's last letter to Catherine, about his son inheriting the secret, about the chain of guardians that was supposed to protect the poems through generations. Somewhere that chain had broken her grandfather or great-grandfather must never have been told. The diary had been hidden away, the poems forgotten, but in a way, that had been part of the protection too. The poems had been so perfectly camouflaged, so completely hidden in plain sight, that they'd simply become invisible, just another volume among thousands, waiting. And now it was her turn, her responsibility, not to hide them anymore, but to share them, to honor Catherine's hope that someday the world would be ready. She would do this carefully, thoughtfully, with proper scholarship and context. She would make sure Catherine's full life was represented, not just the hidden poet, but the published writer, the salon host, the activist, the lover, the friend. She would tell the story of how these poems survived, of Nathaniel's courage in protecting them, and her own stumbling upon them across so many years. She would make sure the forget-me-not bookplate was photographed and explained. Those two sets of initials preserved as Catherine had wanted a friendship remembered. Two people who fought for truth in their quiet way. The next months were full of purposeful activity. Marcus worked on his literary analysis, comparing Catherine's hidden poems to her published works and to the broader context of Victorian women's poetry. His conclusion was unequivocal. The hidden poems were exceptional work by any standard, deserving a place in the canon of 19th century literature. Grace compiled a complete biographical timeline, drawing on census records, newspapers, the journals, and correspondence. Catherine's life emerged in detail: her childhood in a prosperous London family, her education, her early awareness of being different, her marriage to Edward Ashford and his death, her independent life in Bath, her relationships with women, her literary career, her political engagement, her salon, her final years after Margaret's death. Evelyn worked with both of them to shape the story, to decide how to present the discovery to the world. They agreed on a book, a scholarly edition of the hidden poems with extensive notes and introduction, plus selections from Catherine's journals and letters, reproductions of relevant documents, and essays about the literary and historical context. They also agreed to publish an article first, announcing the discovery and whetting scholarly appetite. Marcus took the lead on writing it, with Evelyn and Grace contributing sections about the discovery and research process. The poems of Catherine Thornton Ashford, a major Victorian voice recovered, was accepted by Victorian studies and created immediate excitement in literary circles. Within days of publication, Evelyn was fielding calls from scholars, journalists, documentary makers, and publishers. The book came together over the following year. Evelyn made several more trips to Bath, photographing locations connected to Catherine's life. She visited 14 Royal Crescent, the elegant Georgian townhouse where Catherine had lived and hosted her salons, now divided into flats, but still graceful and dignified. She spent an afternoon at Bath Abbey Cemetery, bringing flowers to Catherine's grave, photographing the stone in different lights, sitting nearby and feeling connected to this woman she'd never met, but had come to know so intimately. Louise Hartley and her family came to London to visit the shop, to see where the poems had been hidden for so long. Evelyn showed them the burgundy-bound volumes, the precise shelf where the false Shelley had waited, the reading corner where she'd first opened it and realized what she'd found. Catherine would be pleased, I think, Louise said, standing in the shop surrounded by books, to know that her poems are finally being shared, that her full story can be told. The book launched in September, 2 years after Evelyn's discovery. The Hidden Poems of Catherine Thornton Ashford, Love, Literature, and Life in Victorian England, was published by Oxford University Press, a handsome volume with the forget-me-not bookplate reproduced on the cover. The launch event was held at Bellamy and Son, the shop crowded with scholars, journalists, book lovers, and members of the LGBTQ+ community who saw Catherine's story as part of their history. Marcus gave a talk about the poem's literary merit. Grace discussed the research process, and Evelyn read several of Catherine's poems aloud, her voice carrying through the shop, giving life to words that had been silent for so long. She read the one she thought Catherine would have wanted people to hear first. In gardens where we dare not walk by day, we meet as shadows meet when sun descends, and speak in glances what we cannot say, and hold in secret what the world offends. Yet love remains itself, though hid from sight, as stars exist, though daylight blinds our eyes, and what is true by nature's ancient right needs, not the world's permission to arise. So we shall love as we were meant to love, in shadows if we must, in silence when the noise of judgment thunders from above. But love nonetheless, again, again, again. The room was silent when she finished. Then someone began to applaud, and others joined, and the sound filled the shop, a celebration across time, an acknowledgement of courage and truth. Later, after most guests had left, Evelyn stood in the reading corner with Marcus, Grace, and a few close friends, looking at the display they'd created, the original false Shelley volume in a protective case, pages open to show Catherine's handwriting, reproductions of diary entries and letters, photographs of Catherine's grave and her Bath home, the forget-me-not bookplate enlarged and framed. "You did it," Marcus said to Evelyn. "You kept the promise Nathaniel made. You brought her voice back." "We all did," Evelyn said. "It took all of us, you, Grace, the Hartleys, Harriet in Bath, everyone who helped piece together her life. But you found her first," Grace pointed out. "You recognized that something extraordinary was hidden in plain sight." Evelyn thought about that moment, opening the hollowed-out ledger, lifting out the diary, recognizing Nathaniel's handwriting. She thought about how easily she might have missed it, how close Catherine's poems had come to remaining hidden forever. "I think," she said slowly, "that Catherine and Nathaniel were counting on someone caring enough to look closely, to ask questions, to persist in finding answers. They made it possible, but they needed someone to complete the work. A relay of guardians," Marcus quoted from Nathaniel's diary, "each doing their part across generations." Outside, evening was falling on Clerkenwell Street, the lamps coming on one by one, casting warm light on the rain-dark cobblestones. The shop felt cozy, safe, full of voices and stories waiting to be discovered. Evelyn looked around at the shelves rising to the ceiling, at the thousands of volumes that filled every space, each one holding its own mysteries, its own secrets, its own connections across time. Somewhere among them might be other hidden treasures, other voices waiting to be heard. The thought filled her with anticipation rather than anxiety. She had time. She had patience. And she had learned from Catherine and Nathaniel the value of careful preservation, of trust across time, of faith that truth would eventually find its moment. She would keep looking, keep asking questions, keep honoring the stories that books held. It was her purpose now, her calling, her way of keeping faith with the past and the future both. As her friends prepared to leave, Evelyn took one more look at the display, at Catherine's words given life again, after so long in hiding. The forget-me-nots on the bookplate seemed to glow in the lamplight. A promise kept, a remembrance honored, a love that had endured when everything else had faded. "Good night, Catherine," she whispered, as she had so many times now. "Thank you for trusting us with your truth." And in the quiet of the shop, among the books and shadows and gentle lamplight, she felt something like an answer, a sense of completion, of connection, of story fulfilled. The mystery was solved, the secret revealed, the poems restored to light. But the work of honoring the past, of listening for hidden voices, of preserving truth against forgetting, that work continued, endless and essential. A promise passed from one generation to the next, from one guardian to another, from silence into speech, from darkness into light. And so, dear listener, our story comes to its gentle close. Catherine's poems are safe now, shared with the world as she hoped they would be someday. Evelyn continues her work at Bellamy and Son, tending the books and their secrets, always watching for the next mystery to unfold. The rain has stopped outside, and stars are emerging in the clear night sky. In the shop, the lamps burn low, casting long shadows across the shelves. Everything is peaceful. Everything is well. Let yourself sink deeper now into comfort. Let the story settle around you like a soft blanket. Catherine found her voice again. Nathaniel's promise was kept. Evelyn solved the mystery with patience and care. All is well. All is resolved. All is peaceful. Sleep now, dear listener. Rest in the knowledge that some mysteries have happy endings, that love endures across time, that truth finds its moment eventually. The books keep their vigil through the night. The words wait patiently on their pages. And you can rest, peaceful and content, knowing that somewhere stories are being preserved, voices are being honored, and tomorrow, when you wake, there will be new mysteries to explore, new stories to discover, new connections to make. But for now, simply rest. Simply breathe. Simply let yourself drift into sleep, carried by Catherine's words, by Evelyn's dedication, by the comfort of books and lamplight, and stories well told. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well.